The morning Milton Turner rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, three different men crossed to the other side of the street to avoid him, and Beatrice Talmadge was the only soul in town who didn't flinch when his shadow fell across her doorstep. She had heard about him, of course. Everyone within a 50-mile radius had heard about Milton Turner. They said he'd broken a man's jaw in Wichita for cheating at cards, that he'd once tracked a cattle thief across 200 miles of open plain and brought him back alive only because the man had begged pretty enough. They said he drank hard and laughed harder, and had never in his 32 years of living on this earth apologized to another human being for a single thing he'd done. They said he was the roughest man in 3 counties, and by every account Beatrice had gathered from the gossip that circulated through the general store, those accounts were not exaggerated. What they didn't say, what nobody seemed to think worth mentioning, was that his eyes were the color of a late October sky just before the first frost, and that when he stepped up onto her porch and removed his hat with a politeness that didn't match a single thing she'd been told about him, she felt something shift quietly in the center of her chest, like a door she hadn't known was closed swinging gently open. "Miss Talmadge," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned patience not from gentleness but from discipline. "I understand you're looking for someone to help work the north fence line." She looked at him with the steady gaze that had made more than one man uncomfortable in the 2 years since she'd taken over her father's homestead alone. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, clear-eyed, and not especially impressed by men who announced themselves like weather events. She had been running 50 acres by herself since her father's heart gave out in the autumn of 1877, and she had done it well enough that the bank had stopped sending letters of gentle concern. "I put the notice up at the livery," she said. "You're the first person to answer it." "That doesn't surprise me," he said. He didn't explain why. He just stood there with his hat in his hands and waited. She studied him a moment longer. He was big in the way that certain men were big, not just in frame, but in presence, like the land itself had made him to the same scale. He had a jaw that looked like it had been hit before and hadn't minded, and his hands were the hands of someone who had worked so long and so hard that the calluses had become permanent features of his skin. He wore a colt on his right hip, which was unremarkable in 1879 Kansas, but he wore it the way most men wore their boots, like it had always been there and he'd stopped thinking about it. "The fence runs about 3 miles, she said. "There are posts that need replacing and wire that needs stringing. It's 2 weeks of work at least, maybe 3. I can offer $1 a day and meals." "That's fair," he said. "I'll take it," she nodded. "You can sleep in the barn. There's a cot in the back room behind the tack." He nodded, settled his hat back on his head, and turned to go gather his horse, and Beatrice Talmadge stood on her porch for a moment longer than was strictly necessary watching him walk, and then went inside and told herself firmly that it was only because she was assessing whether he looked like the kind of man who would do the work he said he would do. She was not entirely convinced by herself. His name in Caldwell sat in people's mouths the way a piece of hard candy does, with a little tension, a little uncertainty about what to do with it. She had asked Tom Hendricks at the livery about Milton Turner before she'd posted the notice, and Tom had scratched the back of his neck and said, "He's straight, far as I know. Doesn't trouble people who don't trouble him." Which was, she had come to understand, the highest recommendation available for a man of Milton Turner's particular type in this part of the country. He started on the fence the very next morning, before she had even come out of the house. She found him at first light already 200 yards out on the north line with a post driver and a straight eye, working with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done hard physical labor for so long it had become indistinguishable from breathing. She brought him coffee and he thanked her without stopping, drinking it in 3 long swallows and handing the cup back. "You've done fence work before," she said. "Done most things before," he said. He was already moving again, positioning the next post. She went back inside and started breakfast, and tried not to think about the fact that the sound of his work, the rhythmic thudding of the post driver carrying across the still morning air, felt oddly like company. She had been lonely for a long time. She didn't say this to anyone, would not have said it to herself in those exact words, but it lived in her body the way cold lives in old stone, always there beneath the surface, especially at night when the house made its creaking sounds, and there was no one to ask whether she'd heard that or not. Her father had been gone nearly 2 years. Her mother had died when Beatrice was 14. She had a brother in Missouri who wrote occasionally and meant well and was uselessly far away. She was not a woman who required a great deal, but she was a woman who had begun to notice that requiring very little was not the same as wanting nothing. Milton Turner ate dinner at her table that first evening without being asked. It wasn't presumptuous, exactly. She had called him in when the food was ready, and he had washed at the pump and come inside and sat down with the same uncomplicated directness he seemed to apply to everything, and they had eaten together in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. "Where are you from?" she asked, eventually. "Started in Tennessee," he said. "Moved west when I was 19, that was 13 years ago." "You never went back?" He looked at her with those October sky eyes and said, "Nothing to go back to," in a tone that closed the subject gently but completely, the way you close a window against coming rain. She didn't press. She understood the shape of that kind of answer. "What brought you to Caldwell?" she asked instead. He cut a piece of bread and considered the question with more attention than it perhaps warranted, which she was beginning to understand was his way. He didn't speak carelessly. "Heard there might be work. I'm not fixed to any particular piece of ground. Does that suit you?" He looked up. "It has," he said. "Mostly." There was something in the mostly that she tucked away without examination. Over the days that followed, a rhythm established itself between them that felt older than their acquaintance, like they were settling into grooves that had been waiting for them. He worked the fence with steady skill, and she ran the rest of the homestead. The chickens and the kitchen garden and the single milk cow named Augusta, who had opinions about everything. And they crossed paths at dawn and at meals, and in the long Kansas evenings when the sky turned colors that seemed almost excessive. She learned things about him not because he offered them easily but because she asked directly and he answered directly, and there was a certain pleasure in that exchange, a cleanness to it. He had done cattle work for most of his adult life, had ridden for 3 different outfits across Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas. He could read well enough and did so when he had access to books, which was not often. He had been in 2 gunfights in his life, both of which he described briefly and without drama, and she believed him when he said neither had been his wanting. He had no family that he kept in contact with. She told him things too, which she noticed only after the fact. About her father and the way he'd taught her to read land the way other men read newspapers. About her brother William and his perfectly ordinary life in Missouri, that she didn't begrudge him but sometimes, in the winter, thought about with a complicated ache. About the way the homestead had nearly broken her in the first 6 months after her father died, and how she had decided one February night, lying awake listening to the wind strip the last of the dried grass from the fields, that she was going to hold on to this land or she was going to die trying, and how that decision had made everything afterward simpler. "You're not what most people expect," he said one evening. They were sitting on the porch steps after dinner, something that had happened without either of them quite deciding it would, watching the first stars appear over the flat dark of the plains. She had her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cool. He had his hat resting on his knee. "What do most people expect?" she asked. He thought about it. "I don't know exactly. Something softer, maybe, or something harder in a different way. People either expect a woman alone on a homestead to be helpless or to be armor-plated. You're neither." She looked at him sideways. "That might be the most words you've said at once since you got here." He almost smiled. She had been watching for it. It was barely a shift in the corners of his mouth, but it was there. Don't get used to it. She did get used to it. That was the trouble. She got used to the sound of him working and the way he took his coffee and the fact that he fixed the hinge on the barn door one afternoon without being asked, simply because it was making noise and noise annoyed him. She got used to his presence the way you get used to a good piece of furniture, the kind that fits so perfectly into a room you can't remember what the room looked like without it. This worried her somewhat. She had been proposed to twice since arriving at her majority, once by a banker's son in Wichita, who had the hands of a man who had never done a hard day's work, and once by a neighbor to the south named Gerald Pratt, who was not unkind, but who had the conversational depth of a dinner plate. She had declined both without great difficulty, and had wondered afterward if she was simply particular, or if something in her had decided early that she would rather have nothing than settle for the wrong thing. Standing at her kitchen window one morning watching Milton Turner lift a fence rail with the ease of someone picking up a piece of paper, she thought that perhaps her particular standards had been pointing somewhere specific all along, and she was only now understanding where. She did not act on this thought. She was a practical woman. But then the night of the Caldwell social came, and things began to shift in ways that practical women cannot always account for. The social was held in May, as it was every year, in the feed barn at the edge of town that they cleared out and strung with lanterns. The Caldwell social was one of those frontier institutions that served as many things simultaneously: a dance, a market, a chance to assess neighbors' circumstances and catch up on news that had accumulated since winter. Beatrice went every year because not going would be noticed, and because she genuinely liked some of the people who attended. Milton Turner said he didn't go to socials. She didn't argue with him. She put on her good blue dress and braided her hair and drove herself to town in the wagon and did not think about him. She was doing reasonably well at not thinking about him for the better part of the first hour when she noticed Calvin Pratt, who was Gerald Pratt's younger and considerably less pleasant brother, watching her from across the room with the particular focused attention of a man who has decided he wants something and hasn't yet accounted for what the thing itself might want. Calvin Pratt had a reputation that was the wrong kind, the kind that made women move their daughters to different sides of rooms. She was careful, she kept herself in company. But at some point in the evening she stepped out onto the side of the barn for some air, because the lantern heat had become stifling, and Calvin Pratt materialized out of the shadow beside her with a smile that didn't reach anywhere useful. "Miss Talmadge," he said, "you're looking well." "Thank you," she said, and moved to go back inside. He put his hand on the wall in front of her, not touching her but making a barrier of himself, and said, "No need to rush back. It's fine out here." "I was just going in," she said, keeping her voice level. "We could talk a while first," he said. "I hear you've got a hired man out at your place, some rough sort." "I have help with the fence," she said. "If you'll excuse me." "A woman alone out there with a man like that," Calvin said, and let the implication hang where it was ugliest. "People talk about things like that." Beatrice looked at him with an expression that her father had once described with some admiration as her collecting face, the face she wore when she was gathering herself for something. "People talk about a great many things," she said, "and are wrong about most of them. Now move your arm, Calvin." The voice came from behind her, from the edge of the light, and it was the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to carry weight. "Move your arm." Calvin Pratt looked up and something happened in his face, a rapid recalculation, the particular expression of a man who has just understood that the odds have shifted against him. Milton Turner stood a few feet away, still in his work clothes, hat on, hands at his sides, and everything about him communicated without a single word spoken that this was not a negotiation. Calvin dropped his arm and stepped back and produced a smile that didn't fit his face. "Just talking," he said. "Sure," Milton said. He looked at Beatrice. "Came to see if you wanted company on the ride home." Calvin slid back inside, and Beatrice stood in the warm spring dark and looked at Milton Turner and felt something that was less like gratitude and more like recognition, the feeling of seeing a thing clearly for the first time that you had been looking at from an angle. "I thought you didn't go to socials," she said. "I don't," he said. "I changed my mind." They drove home in the wagon together, the plains huge and dark and star-scattered around them, the horse moving at an easy walk that neither of them encouraged to hurry. The silence between them had a different quality than it usually did. Something in it was asking a question. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," he said. "I would have managed," she said. "I know that too," he said. She looked at him in the starlight, this man who had come to Caldwell with nothing but a horse and a bedroll and a reputation that preceded him like weather, and she said, "Why did you come then?" He was quiet for a moment. The horse's hooves marked off the seconds. "Because I wanted to," he said. That's all, as if it were the simplest thing. As if wanting something was its own complete justification, straightforward and clean, requiring no further explanation. She had grown up in a world where women were supposed to want things carefully and present those wants apologetically, and here was this man offering his wanting as a plain fact, and she found that she was not prepared for how much she liked it. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. But when they reached her homestead and he handed her down from the wagon seat, his hand around hers was careful in a way that his hands, which were built for rough work, were not usually careful, and he let go slowly. She lay awake that night for a long time. The next 2 weeks had the quality of something building. She felt it in every interaction they had, in the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way she watched him when she thought the same, in the slight shift that had occurred in the comfortable easiness between them, the way a song changes when someone adds a harmony, still recognizable, still itself, but fuller somehow, carrying more. He had nearly finished the north fence. There were perhaps 3 or 4 days of work left. She tried not to think too clearly about what came after that. She was kneading bread one morning when he came to the door, which he did not usually do mid-morning, and stood in the doorframe with something uncertain in his face that she had never seen there before. "I'd like to stay on," he said, "after the fence is done if you have other work." She looked at him with flour on her hands and her hair coming loose from its braid and said, "There's always work on a homestead." "I know that," he said. "I'm asking something else." She set the dough down. She met his eyes. "I know what you're asking," she said. He waited because that was what he did. He waited without pushing, without performing, simply held the space open with the particular patience of a man who understood that some things cannot be hurried. "Yes," she said, "stay on." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was a door opened a little further, and they both understood it exactly for what it was, which was the right thing at the right time. He nodded. "All right," he said, and went back to work. She went back to her bread with a feeling in her chest that was warm and somewhat terrifying, and absolutely, unmistakably welcome. June in Caldwell was long daylight and hot-breathed, and full of the particular busyness of a homestead in early summer. The kitchen garden needed tending, and the hay needed cutting, and Augusta, the milk cow, developed a stubborn refusal to come in from the east pasture that occupied 2 full mornings of creative persuasion. Milton handled most of the heavy field work, and she handled the house and garden, and they moved around each other in the house and yard with the comfortable competence of 2 people who have found their rhythm. And all of it was perfectly natural and perfectly ordinary, and absolutely not ordinary at all. He had, at some point, stopped eating supper in the careful way of a hired hand eating at his employer's table, and started eating the way a person eats at a table that is partly his, which is to say with relaxed attention, passing things without being asked, noticing when the water pitcher was low, once or twice cooking something himself on mornings when she was occupied elsewhere. A fact she discovered when she came in from dealing with Augusta's latest pasture protest, to find a pot of good coffee already made and cornbread cooling on the counter. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the cornbread and felt something large and quiet settle into place inside her. He came in from the barn and saw her standing there and said, "I hope that's all right." "It's more than all right," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him stop in the middle of the room and look at her, really look at her, and for a moment the whole morning paused. "Beatrice," he said, and she said, "I know." And somehow that was enough, those 4 words between them, because they did know, both of them, and acknowledging it, even this obliquely, felt like crossing a line that had been drawn in the dust, unmistakable once you'd stepped over it. He crossed the room, and he did it slowly, giving her every moment to decide differently, and she stood her ground. And when he put his hand against her face, that big, calloused, careful hand, and she leaned into it almost without meaning to, she felt him exhale the way a man exhales when he has been holding his breath without realizing it. He kissed her with the same unhurried deliberateness he applied to everything, and she kissed him back with the full conviction of a woman who, having waited a long time to want something this clearly, was not going to be tentative about it now. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers and said nothing, and she let herself be held in the warm kitchen with the smell of cornbread around them and the sound of the summer morning outside, and thought that she had been right to wait, and right to stay, and right, absolutely right to open that door. They were not immediately anything official. This was 1879 Kansas, and there were proprieties to consider, and also they were both people who moved carefully with important things. But the understanding between them had shifted irrevocably, and the people of Caldwell, who were sharp observers of exactly this kind of shift, noticed it within approximately 10 days. Tom Hendricks at the livery told his wife. His wife told Clara Beaumont at the dry goods store. Clara Beaumont mentioned it to Reverend Ellis with what she probably believed was genuine concern, but was in fact thorough enjoyment. And within a fortnight it was general knowledge in the county that Milton Turner had found himself a homestead and a woman, and that the woman appeared, somewhat incomprehensibly to the social commentators of Caldwell, to want him there. The social commentators were not entirely wrong to find it remarkable. Milton Turner was known in 3 counties for reasons that had nothing to do with tenderness. There were the stories about Wichita and the broken jaw, which were accurate. There was the cattle thief story, which was mostly accurate. There were various other tales of a man who had lived hard and asked no favors and given none, who had moved across the plains like weather, belonging nowhere permanently, softening for no one. What the stories did not capture, what Beatrice was discovering in long summer evenings on the porch and early mornings over coffee, and the 100 small exchanges of a shared life taking shape, was that Milton Turner was a man of deep and genuine feeling, who had simply never had anywhere to put it. He noticed things with an attention that was rare, the way the light changed over the fields in late afternoon, the way she held her shoulders when she was tired versus when she was thinking, the names she used for the individual chickens, and the stories she'd invented to explain their personalities. He remembered everything she told him. He listened with his whole body. One evening she found him on the porch with a book she didn't recognize, a slim volume he'd apparently acquired in town. He didn't hear her come out, and she saw him reading with a focused intensity that was different from his working face, entirely absorbed, and she thought, there it is, the interior of this man that nobody talks about when they're talking about broken jaws and long trails and a colt worn as naturally as skin. "What are you reading?" she asked. He looked up without embarrassment. "Poetry," he said. He showed her the cover. It was Longfellow. She sat down beside him on the step. "Read me some," she said. He looked at her for a moment to determine whether she meant it, and then he looked back at the book and read to her, his low, unhurried voice moving through the lines with a care she recognized from the way he handled everything he valued. And she sat in the fading summer light and thought that she was, without question, in love with Milton Turner, and that this was the least surprising thing that had ever happened to her. July brought a different kind of visitor. His name was Roy Bazin, and he rode into her yard on a Tuesday morning with the look of a man who expected to get what he came for. He was from an outfit called the Rocking D, which operated about 30 miles south, and he had come, he said, to make her an offer on the homestead. "I'm not selling," she said from the porch. "Hear the offer first," he said, with the smile of a man who had made this particular speech before and always got the right answer in the end. "I don't need to hear it," she said. "I'm not selling." Milton had come around from the back of the barn and was standing at the corner of the house. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His presence had a quality about it in moments like this that was its own complete statement. Roy Beeson looked at him and looked back at Beatrice. "The Rocking D is prepared to offer a generous price." "I'm sure it is," Beatrice said, "and I'm sure you'll find other sellers. Good day, Mr. Beeson." He lingered a moment longer than courtesy required, which was the kind of thing men did when they were deciding whether a situation was worth escalating, and then made a decision and tipped his hat and rode back out the way he'd come. Milton came up to the porch. "He'll be back," he said. "I know," she said. "The Rocking D has been after this land for 2 years. They want access to the creek on the south edge." "What do you want to do?" "The same thing I've always done," she said. "Hold on to what's mine." He nodded. "Then we will," he said, and the "we" landed in the sentence like it had always lived there, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and there was nothing more to say. Roy Beeson came back 3 more times over the course of July, each time with a higher number and a slightly less pleasant manner. The third time, Milton met him at the gate and the conversation was brief and not especially warm, and after that Roy Beeson did not come again. Beatrice did not ask what was said. She understood enough about Milton Turner by now to know that whatever had been said was precisely what needed to be said, no more and no less. The summer deepened. They spent evenings on the porch reading or talking or sitting in comfortable silence, and the silence had changed entirely from what it had been when he first arrived. It was now the silence of 2 people whose presence together is enough, who don't need noise to fill the space because the space itself is full. She had not known before this that silence could be a form of intimacy. She was learning a great many things. She was also learning that a man's reputation and a man's character are frequently 2 entirely different documents. The reputation said rough, immovable, solitary, without softness. The character said careful, observant, quietly funny when he chose to be, capable of a tenderness that was more genuine for being unperformed. He never courted her in the showy way, no elaborate declarations or theatrical gestures. What he did instead was small and continuous, the extra log on the fire on a cool morning, the way he always noticed when she was troubled before she said anything, the afternoon he spent without comment rebuilding the shelf in the kitchen that had been crooked since her father built it and that she had simply learned to accommodate. "You didn't have to do that," she said when she saw it. "It was bothering you," he said. "You noticed that." "I notice everything about you," he said, with the plain directness that she had come to understand was not carelessness, but in fact the opposite, the most deliberate honesty she had ever received from another person. And she stood in her kitchen with the good straight shelf and felt something that had no name she could easily reach for, big and warm and absolutely certain. August was when she knew without any remaining shadow of doubt. She had been working late in the kitchen garden, later than she should have, and when she finally came inside it was past dark and she was tired to the bone, and she sat down at the kitchen table and put her head on her arms, meaning only to rest for a moment. She woke to the sound of him moving quietly in the kitchen, the soft sounds of him warming a plate of food for her, and she watched him through the drowsy veil of half-sleep, this big careful man moving quietly so as not to disturb her, and she thought, "I want this for the rest of my life." Not the food, though the food was welcome, him, moving through my days with me. This. She must have made some sound because he looked over and saw that she was awake and said, "Thought you might be hungry," and set the plate on the table. She looked at him across it. "Milton," she said. "Yes," he said, and sat down across from her, and in the lamplight he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been rough and solitary and unanswering for most of his life, and was now sitting in a kitchen in Kansas at night because there was nowhere else on the planet he wanted to be. "I love you," she said. He was still for a moment. Something moved across his face that she could not have described, a whole landscape passing in an instant, like light on moving water. "Beatrice," he said, and his voice had a different quality than she'd ever heard in it, stripped of the careful control he usually maintained, open as a field. "I have loved you," he said slowly, "since the morning I brought you coffee and you handed the cup back and went back inside like you'd done it 1,000 times, like I already belonged here." She felt her eyes sting. She blinked it back. "You did already belong here," she said. "I just hadn't caught up yet." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "I'm not easy," he said. "You know that." "I'm not easy either," she said. "I know," he said, and almost smiled. And this time it was fully a smile, not the half-hidden barely there shift she'd spent weeks watching for, but a real one, warm and complete. And she thought she might have to spend the rest of her life making him smile like that just for the pleasure of seeing it. September came in gold and copper, and the particular sharp clarity of plains air when summer has finally conceded. The hay was in. The garden had been put up. Jars lined up on the pantry shelves, with the satisfaction of every jar representing a day's hard work, now stored against the coming cold. The homestead had never looked better, the fence running clean and straight across the north line, the barn tight against what the winter would bring, the house itself sitting solid in the way that houses sit when they are properly cared for. Milton Turner asked Beatrice Talmadge to marry him on a September evening on the porch steps with the sunset doing something improbable and beautiful over the Kansas plain, and the smell of early autumn in the air. He did not make a speech. He was not a man for speeches. He simply said, "I'd like to do this properly. I'd like to marry you," and held her gaze with those October sky eyes and waited, because that was always what he did. He gave her space to decide. She said yes before he'd finished the sentence. He put a ring on her finger that he'd bought from the jeweler in Caldwell, a simple gold band because he knew her well enough by now to know she was not a woman for ornamentation, and it fit perfectly, which somehow felt important. "How did you know the size?" she asked. "I noticed," he said. Of course he had. She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that comes from deep happiness rather than mere amusement, the kind that fills up a space completely. And Milton Turner looked at her laughing in the September light, and something in his face said that he had not known, not really known, that this was available to him, this particular kind of life, until he found it here. They married in October, in the church in Caldwell on a bright cold day with the plains going tawny all around them. Reverend Ellis performed the ceremony with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been quietly rooting for this outcome since August. Tom Hendricks was there. Clara Beaumont wept, which pleased her as social events usually pleased her. Beatrice wore her blue dress and had fresh flowers from Clara's garden in her hair, and felt that she was doing exactly the right thing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, which is a gift that not everyone is given and which she did not take lightly. Milton stood at the front of the church in clean clothes and his good hat, and looked at her coming down the aisle with an expression she had not seen on him before, unguarded and reverent and absolutely without the careful control he usually kept in place. And she thought, walking toward him, that she would remember his face in this moment for the rest of her life. "You look beautiful," he said, which was not something he said with any frequency, and it arrived with the weight of things said rarely. "You look terrified," she said quietly. "Happily terrified," he said. She took his hand and they turned to face Reverend Ellis and the small gathered community of people who had come to witness this unlikely and entirely inevitable thing, and Beatrice felt the full weight of the moment settle around her, not heavy but substantial, the way good things are, real and solid in hers. The winter of 1879 was harsh. The plains west of Caldwell were not gentle in winter, and this particular winter seemed to take the assignment seriously, cold coming early and staying late and testing everything it touched. The homestead proved itself. The barn held, the house held, and the work that Milton and Beatrice had put into the place through the summer and fall returned to them now in the form of security. Hay stacked high and wood stacked higher and food enough in the pantry to outlast whatever the season intended. They were, by any measure, good at being in a house together during a long winter. This is not nothing. There are people who love each other perfectly well in good weather, and discover in close winter quarters that they are entirely incompatible. Beatrice and Milton were not those people. He gave her enough space in the mornings, which she needed, having always been a person who required time to properly enter the day. She didn't try to make him converse at length before he was ready. He made coffee. She made everything else. They read to each other in the evenings by the fire and argued pleasantly about Longfellow's relative merits compared to other poets of whom she had more knowledge than he did, and he listened to her arguments with genuine attention, and occasionally changed his mind and told her so, which she found wildly attractive for reasons she considered carefully and then decided were entirely straightforward. She was also, she discovered by November, expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning over breakfast, because she was not a woman for elaborate presentations of information, and she watched his face go through a rapid succession of things, surprise and then something that was not quite recognizable for a moment, and then resolved itself into a pure and uncomplicated joy that she had not seen on him before. He got up from the table and crossed to her and put his hands on her face and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. "Well," he said finally. "Well," she agreed. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm very well," she said. "Are you?" "I don't have words for it," he said. Which, for a man who chose his words as carefully as Milton Turner did, was as complete an expression of feeling as was possible. He was different after that, not changed exactly, but expanded somehow, as if some internal structure that had been set to a smaller size had been gently opened. He was more demonstratively careful with her, not hovering. She would not have tolerated hovering, but attentive in a new way. She caught him more than once simply watching her with that open, unguarded expression he usually reserved for private moments when he thought she wasn't looking, and she let him watch because she understood what she was seeing. A man who had spent the better part of his life with nothing to hold now holding everything that mattered to him, still adjusting to the weight and the warmth of it. Winter was also, it turned out, a good time for talking. The long evenings by the fire, the way the cold outside made the inside feel more its own complete world, drew things out of them that the busy summers might have kept tucked away. He told her more about Tennessee, about his mother who had been a strong woman in a difficult life and had died when he was 16, about the older brother who had tried to hold a failing farm together and failed, and the family's dispersal after, the scattered pieces of a life that had never quite reconstituted into something solid until now. She told him about her mother, about the particular grief of losing a mother when you are 14 and still forming yourself, about the way her father had tried to fill that space and had succeeded in some ways and not in others, and how she had loved him completely in spite of the gaps. "You learned to carry a lot by yourself," he said one night. "So did you," she said. "Maybe that's why we fit," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it means neither of us knew how to let someone help and now we're learning." He thought about that. "Both can be true," he said. "Yes," she said. "Both can be true." The sun arrived in late June of 1880 on a summer morning with the windows open and the smell of the fields coming in, and they named him Thomas after Beatrice's father with Milton's quiet agreement that the name was right. Thomas Turner was, from his first hours, a person with opinions, which his mother found gratifying and his father found funny in a way he didn't entirely hide. Milton with a child in his arms looked like something from a story Beatrice couldn't quite believe was her own life. Those hands, which had driven fence posts and worked cattle, and on more than one occasion persuaded difficult men to reconsider their positions, held Thomas with a completeness of care that she found she could not look at without feeling something large and warm move through her. He was not awkward with the baby as some men were. He was careful and present and entirely concentrated, the same qualities he brought to everything he valued. She was nursing Thomas one evening when he came and sat beside her and watched them both in the lamp light, and she said, "What are you thinking about?" "How I got here," he said, "from there to this." "Is that a good thought or a strange one?" "Both," he said, "but mostly good. Mostly I think I don't deserve it." "I don't think it's about deserving," she said. I think it's about choosing. You kept choosing to stay. He looked at her. I will always choose to stay, he said. She believed him completely. The summer of 1880 was also when the real story of the title passed into the county's permanent record, because August that year brought a storm that people in Caldwell would talk about for the next decade. It had been building for 2 days, the way the worst storms do, the sky thickening and the air changing its quality, growing heavy and still, and charged with something that the animals felt before the humans understood. Milton had been watching the sky with increasing concern since the morning of the second day, checking the barn, checking the roof, checking the water barrels and the storm shutters that they'd been meaning to reseal since spring and had not yet gotten to. Beatrice was inside with Thomas, who was 2 months old and sleeping in the way that young babies sleep, completely and without apology. She was at the window watching the sky turn the particular greenish yellow that precedes the worst kind of plain storm when she understood that this was not going to be an ordinary summer thunderstorm. How bad? She called to Milton, who had just come in from the barn. Very, he said, already moving. I need to get some things from the barn and then I want us in the root cellar. Thomas is first, then you, then whatever you need from the house. I'll get the rest. She gathered Thomas from his cradle, wrapping him securely against her body, and she got the things that mattered from the house, the cash money she kept in the tin on the high shelf, her father's watch, the important papers in the tin box under the bed. Milton came back from the barn and swept a look around the house and grabbed several more things with the efficient practicality of a man who had assessed disaster before and knew what mattered. They were in the root cellar with the door pulled shut when the storm hit. It hit with a fury that was almost personal. The ground shook with it. She could hear things above them, the sounds of the world being reorganized, and she held Thomas tight against her, and Milton held her against him, his arm around her solid and steady, and she felt him very deliberately not tense, making himself a calm structure for her to lean into, and she thought even in the middle of it what a remarkable thing that was. This man who had nothing but the ability to be a wall between her and whatever was coming. The storm lasted 2 hours. When it passed, they emerged from the cellar into a world that had been rearranged. The barn had taken damage. Part of the roof on the west side had gone. 3 of the fence sections on the north line were down. A tree she had loved, a cottonwood that had stood at the edge of the yard since before she was born, was on its side. But the house was standing. The root cellar had protected everything they'd brought into it. Thomas was awake and unhappy about the noise but entirely unharmed. She stood in the aftermath of the storm, Thomas in her arms, and surveyed the damage with the particular grief of someone who loves a piece of land and has seen it hurt. Milton stood beside her. We'll rebuild, he said. The barn first, then the fence. The cottonwood, she said. He looked at the fallen tree and then at her and understood that she was not talking about lumber. I know, he said. He put his hand at the back of her neck and she leaned into him and allowed herself a moment of grief for the tree before she straightened and started making a list in her head. The days after the storm were hard work. Neighbors came to help, because that was what neighbors did on the Kansas plains in 1880. The Caldwell community understanding that the storm which had taken her barn roof could as easily have taken any one of theirs. Tom Hendricks came. The Beaumont family came. Even Gerald Pratt, the neighbor to the south, came with his sons and put in 2 full days on the barn roof without being asked, which was the kind of thing the plains produced in its people, alongside everything else it produced. Milton worked from before sunrise to after dark for a week. She brought him food and water in the field and worked beside him where she could, with Thomas in the carrier against her chest, and the combination of the shared work and the shared purpose and the watching of the community come together around them made her feel something she could only describe as rooted, a sense of belonging to a place and a people and a life that went all the way down. By the end of September, the barn was repaired and the fence was up, and a young cottonwood had been planted in the spot where the old one had fallen, because Milton had gone to the creek bottom and dug one up without telling her, and she found it planted one morning, small and earnest in the autumn light, and she stood and looked at it until she could see it clearly. She found him in the barn when she could see clearly again, and she said, "That was an extraordinarily kind thing to do." And he looked at her with that particular expression she had come to love most in him, not the half-smile but the full open face he kept usually for private moments, and he said, "The tree was important to you." "So are you," she said. "I know," he said simply. Not arrogant, just certain, the way he was certain of things he'd verified completely. She had told him so enough times, and shown him so enough times that he had, at last, in the manner of a man who requires evidence before he believes a thing, believed it. The following spring brought changes to Caldwell that were coming to many frontier towns in 1881, the push and pull of settlement and progress, and the complicated question of what the plains were going to become. The railroad had extended further west, bringing new people and new commerce and a certain energy that was not entirely comfortable if you'd been there before it arrived. Prices changed. Land values changed. The Rocking D made another offer on the homestead, this time through a lawyer in a suit who came on the train, and this time the offer was very large indeed. Beatrice and Milton sat with it at the kitchen table after Thomas had been put to bed, and they talked about it the way they talked about important things, directly and without rushing. "It's a great deal of money," she said. "It is," he said. "We could go somewhere," she said. "Buy more land further west, start fresh with more capital than we could save in 10 years of work." He looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. She looked at the kitchen where she had stood with flour on her hands and said yes to him staying. She thought about the cottonwood. She thought about her father's grave on the east side of the property and the way she visited it on Sunday mornings. "I don't want to sell," she said. "Then we don't sell," he said. "It's not just my decision," she said. "It's yours too." He shook his head. "It was yours first, and you love this land." "And you," she said. "I love what's on it," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Then we hold on," she said. "We hold on," he agreed. They sent the lawyer back on the train with a polite and final refusal, and the Rocking D, whatever its ambitions, found somewhere else to direct them. 1882 found them settled deeply into the life they'd built with the comfortable solidity of something well constructed and properly cared for. Thomas was nearly 2 and had developed, as Beatrice had predicted, extremely strong opinions about the world, particularly about Augusta the milk cow, who he considered his personal friend and ally in all things. Milton had taken on work for 2 neighboring homesteads in addition to their own, his reputation as a man who could be trusted to handle things having undergone, in the years since his arrival, something of a transformation, not in the underlying facts of who he was, but in the county's understanding of what those facts meant. He was still considered the roughest man in 3 counties. He was also now considered a man whose word was bedrock, whose work was excellent, and who had, against all reasonable expectation, become exactly the kind of person a community in the hard work of establishing itself on the plains needed. Beatrice heard this about him from Clara Beaumont one afternoon at the dry goods store, where Clara reported it with the proprietary pleasure of someone who had been rooting for the outcome. And she listened and thanked Clara and walked home with Thomas in the wagon and thought about the particular satisfaction of being married to a man who had grown into a good name without losing a single thing that made him who he was. She was also, by the spring of 1882, expecting their second child. This one announced itself differently than Thomas had, not with the clean certainty of the first time, but with a kind of settled assurance, like the land itself in early spring, still cold but unmistakably in the process of becoming something warmer. She told Milton on a morning in March when the first pale green was showing along the creek bottom, and he took in the news with the same unguarded joy as the first time, but without the stunned quality, more simply happy, the happiness of a man who has learned that his life contains good things and who no longer finds this surprising. "Thomas needs a companion," he said. Thomas needs someone to instruct, she said. He already considers himself in charge of the yard. He gets that from someone, he said, with the particular expression that meant she was the someone in question. He gets it from his father, she said. He has your certainty about things. My certainty about things has served us well, he said. It has, she agreed. I'm not arguing. He laughed, which he did more now, a genuine whole sound that she collected the way some people collect beautiful objects for the pure pleasure of having it. The baby arrived in September, a girl this time, which Thomas received with generous 2-year-old magnanimity, petting her head with the delicacy of a child who has been very carefully instructed. And she had Beatrice's dark hair and Milton's October sky eyes, and from her first moments seemed to be conducting a steady appraisal of the world around her that her father recognized and her mother found entirely appropriate. They named her Clara, after Clara Beaumont, who had been a kinder neighbor than she'd needed to be and had never once, in the years of Beatrice's solitary homesteading, made her feel anything other than respected. Clara Beaumont, when informed of the honor, produced from her husband's account tears that were entirely genuine, and a batch of the finest honey cake Caldwell had ever tasted. Clara Turner grew into her father's observation and her mother's directness, and Thomas Turner grew into the kind of boy who had definite ideas about justice and would argue them to anyone who would stand still long enough, which was a quality both his parents found exhausting and secretly admired. They were, as siblings sometimes are, entirely different and deeply bonded, and the sound of the two of them together in the yard while Beatrice worked in the kitchen garden was the specific sound she associated with being exactly where she was supposed to be. Milton had a gray starting at his temples by 1883, which Beatrice considered distinguished and told him so, and which he considered with the patient skepticism he applied to any flattery before quietly accepting it. He was 36 years old and lean, and still moved with the economy of a man who had lived in his body as a working tool for a long time, but there was something easier about him now, something that had nothing to do with age, more like a man who has put down something heavy that he had carried for a very long time. She asked him about this one evening, what it felt like, the difference between the man he'd been before Caldwell and the man he was now. He thought about it for a long time, which was his way with the things that mattered. Like I was traveling somewhere, he said finally. The whole time, all those years, just moving. And then I got here and I realized I wasn't traveling anymore. I'd arrived, and it turned out the place was you. She sat with that for a moment. The plains were gold outside the window and the sound of the children sleeping was somewhere in the house and the lamp made a warm circle on the table. The place was us, she said. Yes, he said, the place was us. She reached across and took his hand and he turned it and laced his fingers through hers, and they sat in the lamp light with the big quiet Kansas dark outside, and the life they'd built gathered around them. And it was entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary in the way that only the best and most true things are. The summer of 1884 brought an event that both of them would later identify as the moment Caldwell stopped being merely where they lived and became, without question, home. There was a dispute, not uncommon in those years of the frontier's consolidation, about water rights on the creek that ran between 3 properties including their own. The Rocking D, which had been a quiet presence since the lawyer had been sent back on the train, reemerged as an interest through a proxy purchase of the property to the north. The legal question was tangled and the stakes were real, and the community meeting that was called to address it was the kind of meeting that could go several directions. Milton stood up at that meeting in the Caldwell feed barn turned assembly room, which had been the site of his first and only social, and he spoke with the plain precision of a man who had thought carefully about what mattered and had no interest in waste of time. He knew water law and land law with the practical knowledge of someone who had spent 15 years navigating the frontier's shifting rules, and he laid out the case with a clarity that the room recognized as both honest and correct. What he also said, and what Beatrice, sitting in the second row with Clara on her lap and Thomas pressed against her side, felt into her chest like something clean and permanent, was this. These homesteads were built by the people in this room on land that wasn't given to them by anyone. They built them with work and stayed through things that drove other people out. The creek is a common resource that serves common need. Anyone who tries to corner that resource for private advantage isn't disputing a water right. They're disputing the right of every family in this valley to exist on this land. I'll spend as long as it takes in court to make sure that's understood. The room was quiet for a moment after he sat down. Then Tom Hendricks said, "I'll match whatever time and money you put in." And Gerald Pratt said the same thing. And one by one the room agreed, and the legal case that followed was brief and clear-cut because, it turned out, the law in this instance was on the side of the homesteaders, and the Rocking D's latest gambit came to nothing. Beatrice found his hand in the crowded room afterward and held it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that his hand in hers didn't already say. That evening after the children were asleep, she told him, "You have been the finest thing in my life." He looked at her with the full open face she had first seen at their wedding and said, "You gave me a life to be fine in." They sat by the fire long into the night, talking with the ease of people who have run out of barriers to each other, and it was the kind of conversation that had no particular subject and covered everything. And it ended, as their evenings often did, with his arm around her and her head against his shoulder, and the fire burning down to coals, and neither of them in any hurry to move. The year 1885 brought the last significant trouble the homestead would see, which was a dry summer of the kind that tested the plains periodically as if to remind the people on them that they had not, in fact, been given an easy thing. The creek dropped. The garden suffered. 3 of their neighbors sold and moved east, which was a grief for the community and a warning to the rest. Milton and Beatrice held. They had held before. They made adjustments without drama, cutting back on what could be cut back, drawing on the reserves they'd been careful to build. Augusta the cow, who was now elderly and had mellowed only somewhat in her opinions, continued to provide. The chickens were philosophical about the heat. Thomas, at age 5, was deeply interested in the irrigation ditch, project his father undertook with the seriousness of a man who had accepted it as important, and spent several days helping at the edge of his abilities and somewhat beyond them. In the evenings of that dry, difficult summer, Beatrice and Milton sat on the porch and watched the burned gold of the plains and talked about the future with the clear-eyed pragmatism of people who have been through enough together to trust that they can assess a situation honestly without losing their footing. "Do you regret staying?" he asked her one evening during the driest stretch. "No," she said. "Not quickly but completely." "Do you regret coming?" "Never," he said. "Not a single morning." She believed him. She believed him because she knew by now what it looked like when Milton Turner wasn't sure of something, the slight weight he carried when he was working something out, and this had none of that weight. This was as simple and clean as anything he'd ever said, as certain as the land under their feet. The rains came back in late August, slow and steady and enough, and the plains revived with the particular resilience that the plains always had. The grass coming back green where it had gone brown, the creek rising, the evening air losing its dusty edge, and filling with the smell of wet earth that was one of the finest smells in the world. Beatrice stood in the rain that first day it came, just stood in it in her yard with her face up, and she felt Milton come to stand beside her, both of them getting soaked in the unceremonious September rain, and she laughed and he put his arm around her. And she felt 16 years older than when she'd first stood on this land alone, and 1,000 years younger at the same time. And the rain came down on the homestead, and the cottonwood her father had loved was still down, but the young cottonwood Milton had planted was green and growing, and the house was full, and the fields would recover, and the life was good. By 1887, the homestead had doubled in its improved acreage. Milton had bought the adjacent 40 acres to the east when the Whitfield family moved west to Oregon, and added it to their operation with the careful expansion of a man who knew what he could manage and didn't take on more. Thomas was 7, and in the Caldwell School, where he excelled at figures and history, and argued with his teacher about the latter in ways that the teacher apparently found more amusing than disruptive. Clara was 5 and had decided, apparently finally, that her mother's kitchen was the most interesting place in the world, and appeared at Beatrice's elbow during cooking with a frequency and attentiveness that was flattering and occasionally impractical. A third child arrived in the summer of 1887, a boy, and they named him Henry after no one in particular, except that it was a name that sounded right for him from the first moment, solid and plain and capable of growing into different things. Henry was a peaceful baby in a way that Thomas had not been, and Clara had been only intermittently, and Milton held him in the early evenings with a look on his face that Beatrice had catalogued, and would defend against any claim that Milton Turner was not a man of feeling. One evening when Henry was 3 months old and the summer evening was long and warm and the older children were asleep, Milton sat in the chair by the window with the baby on his chest, Henry's small face turned against his shoulder, both of them with their eyes closed, and Beatrice came in from the kitchen and stopped in the doorway and looked at them for a long moment. This was her life, this man, these children, this land that she'd held against every reason not to. The light was going golden through the window, and the house smelled of supper and hay, and the particular smell of a lived-in home that she had made from nothing and would pass to these children who carried both her blood and his. She went and sat beside him on the arm of the chair, and he opened his eyes and looked at her and said nothing, because he didn't need to, because they had arrived at the place that the best marriages reach, where the whole conversation of their lives together was available in a look. "I think we're doing all right," she said. "Better than all right," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "better than all right." Henry slept on his father's chest, and the evening light came through the window and lay across them both, and the house held them all within it. And outside the Kansas plains went out in every direction, vast and indifferent and beautiful and entirely uncaring of the small human dramas played out against their face. And inside this particular small house on 50 improved acres, beside a creek that the law had confirmed was common resource, Beatrice and Milton Turner had built something that none of the stories about him, none of the reputation that preceded him through 3 counties, none of the solitary hard years he'd spent before he came to her door, had suggested was possible. And yet here it was, possible and actual and real. Thomas came downstairs for a glass of water and found his parents sitting together in the half-dark in the quiet way that he had been seeing them sit his whole life, and went back upstairs with his water without disturbing them, in the half-conscious wisdom of a 7-year-old who understands that some things are complete in themselves and don't require addition. Milton came to the homestead as a hired hand in the spring of 1879, when the plains were coming back to life after winter, and a widow was trying to hold 50 acres together by herself, and the most anyone in Caldwell would say for him was that he was straight and didn't trouble people who didn't trouble him. He had come to her door not with any intention of staying, not with any plan for what came after, only with the simple fact of wanting work and the ability to do it. But life on the plains had a way of building things from modest materials, from $1 a day and meals and a cot in the back of the tack room, from coffee handed back without ceremony, from a woman who looked at a man clearly without flinching at what she saw, and a man who looked back and saw someone worth staying for. From all of that, and the 10 years that followed, something had been built that was not fragile and not finished, but was solid and growing and full of the particular life that belongs only to things made from genuine materials. On a morning in the autumn of 1889, 10 years after Milton Turner had first ridden into Caldwell with nothing but a horse and a reputation, Beatrice stood at the kitchen window watching him in the yard. He was teaching Thomas, who was 9 now and serious about it, how to assess a fence line for weakness, the two of them walking the perimeter with the same unhurried deliberateness that Milton brought to everything. Clara was in the kitchen behind her, stirring something with great dedication, and Henry was somewhere in the yard conducting an independent investigation of the world that would require reporting to his mother at some point. The cottonwood Milton had planted the autumn after the big storm was 10 years old, and had reached a height that now offered genuine shade to the east side of the yard in the afternoon. The barn roof that had been rebuilt after the storm was still sound. The north fence, the first fence she had hired him to repair, ran clean and straight across the property line with the new sections they'd added when they bought the Whitfield land. She stood at the window and thought about the morning he'd first appeared on her porch, hat in hand, with the reputation and the October sky eyes and the patience of something that had decided to wait without knowing what for. She thought about the storm and the cellar and his arm around her in the dark while the world moved above them. She thought about 10 years of mornings and suppers and seasons and children and drought and rain and legal battles and small kindnesses and large ones, and the way they had fought sometimes, cleanly and directly and without cruelty, and made up the same way, and how even the fighting had been evidence of two people taking each other seriously enough to disagree. She thought about what she'd told him once, that he'd always belonged here, that she just needed to catch up. She believed it more now than she had then. She believed it with the full weight of everything that had followed. He looked up from the fence line across the yard and found her at the window and held her gaze for a moment, just a moment, with that full, open face, and she raised her hand and he raised his, and Thomas said something that recaptured his father's attention, and he turned back to teaching their son about fences. Clara said from behind her, "Mama, is this stirred enough?" "Come, let me look," Beatrice said, and turned from the window and went back into the life she had built and chosen and loved, which was exactly where she intended to be. She had been told once, by a woman in Caldwell whose name she had since forgotten, that a woman in her situation, alone on a homestead, should be practical above all things, should want safety and stability and sensible arrangements, should not expect the kind of things she'd read about in the wrong kind of books. Beatrice Talmadge Turner had been practical. She had been practical every single day of her adult life, practical and strong and steady and equal to the demands of the life she'd chosen. She had also been extraordinarily lucky, and she knew it, and she did not take it for granted for a single morning of the thousands of mornings she had woken up in the house on 50 acres in Caldwell, Kansas, beside the roughest man in 3 counties, who was also the most careful man she had ever known, and who had been, without any question, the finest thing that had ever come to her door. Henry came running in from the yard with something important to report about a toad he had found near the water barrel, and Clara abandoned her stirring to inspect it, and the kitchen filled with the sound of her children arguing pleasantly about the toad's intentions, and Beatrice stood in the middle of it and laughed, the deep kind, the kind that came from all the way inside, and outside Milton Turner was walking the fence line with his oldest son, teaching him to see weakness before it became damage. And the Kansas sky went out and out and out in every direction, enormous and blue and full of weather to come, and they were all of them ready for it.